Hello and welcome everyone to another awesome episode of Altitude. I'm Woody Woodworth, of course, and today I have a great guest for us. Super excited to get into all the material today with Stephen Saunders, who most recently is the founder of Silverlinings, but as many of you may know, a very well decorated author and veteran of networking and telecommunications. Stephen, thank you so much for being on the show today.
Yeah, thanks, Woody. You can call me Steve. Only my mum calls me Stephen, and that's when I'm in trouble. So it makes me shudder a bit when people call me that. It's nice to be here. I really appreciate you having me on the show today. Yeah, looking forward to it.
Absolutely. No, the pleasure is mine. I know we have a lot of cool topics we can cover. We are like minds, you and I.
Absolutely.
But first, let's talk a little bit about Silver Linings, because that's kind of your latest project. You've had many successful projects, but this is kind of the new hot one.
Yeah.
What led you to create this website and industry forum? Was it that you kind of saw that there was this niche and need for a place to really focus on modern communication and modern networking with, a focus on cloud and multi-cloud? Or was it that you just woke up one day and had a eureka moment and just decided, hell, I'm going to do this?
Like a Copernican moment. A little bit. It was essentially a realization that we were in the middle of one of the great transformations that the communications industry goes through every so often, but that this one was particularly accelerated. The cloud transformation that we're going through, the rise of the hyperscalers has taken everybody by surprise. The challenges that CSPs and telcos are having in monetizing their networks have been significantly worse than anybody thought. The advent of 5G, which frankly has been something of a disaster for telcos because they thought it was going to be a way to charge consumers more, and that's not really what 5G is for. And then the entire cloud and multi-cloud ecosystem and the emergence of that and the complexity that that brings right down to the level of what is it that an individual who works at a large enterprise or a service provider, what is it that they do for a living, and how do they outfit themselves for that role? Do they need open source enterprise IT abilities or five nines telecom SLA oriented skill sets? They need to know about OSS BSS or a whole slew of other data center technologies, or do they need both? And when I looked out and did an analysis of the media, which is obviously what I do for a living, is integrated media, I didn't see anything that was answering those questions. I saw some very good information on vendor websites, and that was about it. And also there was a sort of weird miasma around this area, which I think is driven by the fact that it is really complicated and difficult to understand. So there were a lot of people talking very, very quickly and using lots of words. But if you actually stopped them and said, hey, hold on a second, what does that really mean in the context of what we do now? Is extremely chaotic. And that, of course, is a publisher's dream. We like chaos as publishers. And so I reached out into the market and I encountered some very interesting technology and also some interesting companies, one of which is obviously Aviatrix, which has become, almost like a totem for all of the, the energy in this space around multi-cloud.
You brought up 5G and implicitly the kind of awkward relationship between the cloud service providers or CSPs and the telco industry, insofar as, and I think you would agree with me, the rise of the CSPs also predicates, in some ways, a threat or challenge to your traditional telco market, right? They're building or have built the largest private networks in the world.
Yeah.
They are certainly looking to partner and optimize their relationships with telcos. And they are certainly aware, to your earlier point, that 5G is a technology that, in my opinion, ultimately its beating heart might not be consumer driven.
Absolutely. It was written that way. And I think a lot of people didn't read it was like a student taking an exam question. They didn't read the question properly. The service providers, they're like my son, when we get a new dishwasher, he won't read the instruction manual. It's a disaster. You open it, there's the cat in there. It's like, no, you're not supposed to put him in there. And but you've got to read the instructions. And there are 103,000 patents for 5G, and an awful lot of them have nothing to do with consumer capacity.
Right. So maybe we could characterize the relationship between the CSPs and the telcos in some instances frenemies. Who's going to own really that next generation of 5G services? So we've talked on the show a lot about future innovations in networking and security that are happening in what I call the overlay, right? Which are the services that the CSPs build and provide on top of their infra, but never really drilled into the infra game. So as 5G becomes more and more interesting to industry professionals and the CSPs that want to build services to harness it, how does that impact the future of cloud in terms of where services are going to be built, where services are going to be optimized for? In other words, 5G allows this incredible penetration deeper and deeper into the last mile. And I would argue to the point where the last mile starts to become irrelevant.
Yeah, you got to get it over the infrastructure in the core. Absolutely. I mean, you've got your 5G last mile. And first thing we need to clear up is that it has to be 5G going into 5G, right? It can't be 5G going into a 4G LTE core. That doesn't work, because then all of the clever stuff, which 5G supports, which isn't, capacity, it's things like network slicing and, the ability to program different types of services to run over it, all of that good stuff, that has to have 5G SA core. And so you have to have that. But then, where do those services go when they get closer to the heart of the network, when perhaps they've gone through a data center and out the other side? And there is a huge smorgasbord of different approaches vying to add the capabilities you need as a service provider to run those sort of sophisticated applications over a cloud core. Now, without getting too pitchy, for you, on your behalf, that's what Aviatrix does, right? I mean, you have the capability to run over an AWS gateway and add a lot of intelligence there. IBM has just, bought 30 companies to try to do the same thing. And both of these things are, for me, an example of what I call the telco-ification. Terrible word, but that's okay. Telco-ification of public cloud, right? I think, Woody, you're going in the same direction. Not to put words in your mouth, but you were saying, that last mile sort of becomes irrelevant. But in the core, the public cloud almost becomes irrelevant as an area on the topology of the network, because if you're adding all of these other capabilities to enable the public cloud to act in a sense with that sort of telco capability, then you are moving towards this peaceful kingdom of technologies at some point in the future. And I don't know if that's in 10 years or 5 years or 20 years or whatever, but then you are talking about a network which can support both telco and enterprise traffic seamlessly. And actually those old definitions of who's sending what onto the network almost become irrelevant. I think that's nirvana, isn't it? That's where we want to go.
Right.
But there are some big pieces of the jigsaw missing at the moment. That is unusual, though. It's unusually chaotic in the communications industry at the moment, because we used to have the rule book. Cloud's different. Cloud's not following any rules. And so that's why for a company like Aviatrix, you have this opportunity to come in and get ahead of those curves and say, ooh, that's a big problem. Let's really focus our energies on solving that. And other people are kind of following in your footsteps there, I think, a bit. The question which I would ask you, Woody, is, does it keep you awake at night to sort of think, well, what if AWS turns around and says, hey, those pesky Aviatrix guys, they're doing all of this clever stuff, which, makes us look great. Why don't we just do that? Because we have unlimited money and intellectual capital. Why don't we just go and do what Aviatrix does? And they don't seem at all interested in doing that, which is quite weird, isn't it? I guess because it's a distraction from making trillions of dollars, perhaps. But actually, you have a very friendly relationship with them, don't you? So why do you think that is? That they don't want to take you on in your own backyard, as it were?
There's a lot of reasons. It's a great question. First, still, I would argue, that CSPs are primarily focused on data and data innovation. Insofar as when you're acquiring a new big Fortune 100, Fortune 500 customer, part of the CSP sales motion is to ensure that the data state is firmly anchored in the cloud.
Mm.
Because once you own the data from an innovation perspective, all of the workloads that farm off it like a constellation will thus follow. It's all about initially movement of data so that you can get it very close to the services that will add value to it, like AI and machine learning and deep data insight and data slicing and dicing and these things. This data driven approach means that it's really the workloads and the data that the CSPs are laser focused on because that's what's driving their economy.
Mm.
And the network is something that is important to them, but it is not important to them from a united perspective,
Mm.
right? CSPs are still themselves frenemies. They have partnerships like OCI and Azure or Microsoft, and you see places where they're coming together to provide cool infrastructure offerings, but still they're highly competitive.
Mm.
And it's not in their benefit to offer a uniform connectivity model, especially one that evangelizes cloud operations. To that,
Mm.
they've just said, listen, there's people in the industry that enterprises have already picked that are old school players that are in our marketplace. And for sure, one of these will rise to the top. And they're not fundamentally the people that are driving their big businesses focused on network overlay technologies. CSPs have begged, bartered, stolen, and frankly, they've attracted and kept and retained some of the brightest minds in the telco industry because they're underlay monsters and they're brilliant at building these massive networks that are super redundant and
Right.
super intelligent, but they've shortened the stick on the people that are building the digital infrastructure services on top. And they're just like, oh, someone from the market will come do this because we're so focused on data and innovation. We're just going to kind of let others play in this space. But what they don't miss, what they have missed, excuse me, is this innovator's dilemma, which one of my guests talked about, Luke, on a previous show, which is that your traditional networking shops fundamentally don't understand cloud
Mm.
just from a DNA perspective. And they're already so competitive with each other for traditional networking things because hybrid is real. They have a whole data center business that they have to keep running and be competitive there that they're not building infrastructure services in the cloud
Mm.
that follow a cloud operational model. The CI/CD pipeline DevOps thing is just not something that uh, the secret sauce for they still have yet to discover, right? That they
Right.
haven't really cracked the code on how to make this stuff agile. So that's where companies like Aviatrix come in. I mean, that's when I saw Aviatrix, I'm like, okay, so this makes a lot of sense. They're doing uniform, consistent networking stuff, but more importantly, it's agile, it's
Mm.
programmable, and it's going to cater to the people that are wanting to move fast in cloud so they can take all their tools that they're using to build these applications and use these same tools to build the network.
Mm.
That approach to me was super unique. And I think at the end of the day, it's going to win.
Well, you are innovators, and that's, I think, part of the value of the Aviatrix model, and particularly to define the market as clearly as you have, because, as I said when we were first talking, there's a lot of confusion out there. So, being able to sort of co-opt this space and identify it with your company is incredibly important at a marketing level. Of course, you actually have to do it, but clearly, there's been very significant amounts of money being spent on the technology innovation, and innovation has stalled in a few different places outside of Aviatrix, and one of them obviously is in the telco and tier one service provider market. Companies like that are typically spending 1% of their revenue on R&D. That's a tiny amount of money, and they're kind of trapped in that because traditionally, they're funded through the bond market, and so all of that stuff's just trying to keep track with inflation, which is obviously challenging at the moment. So it doesn't leave a lot of money left over to be justified putting into R&D. So they don't. And they then go and rely on traditional telecom manufacturing companies to provide the necessary skill sets which they need. And some of them are a lot further ahead than others, is all I would say about that. I don't want to name names here, but some of them have sort of seized that nettle early and got ahead. And some of them are increasingly looking like they may not have got the memo about what's really going on. But in some ways, I look at Aviatrix as kind of an outsourced R&D department for the industry, because there is obviously so, and this is your background, obviously. I mean, how long have you been at Aviatrix? A couple of years now?
Yeah, about a year and a half.
I mean, and they hired you for a specific, set of skills, as they say in Taken, but the Liam Neeson phrase. I mean, it wasn't just for your witty banter and your sartorial elegance. You have the black belt qualification from Microsoft. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct. I've said this before, but it's a good chance to say it again. The people that really have become deeply skilled at building overlay networks in the CSP arena are few and far in between, because the CSPs tend to snap these people up or
Right.
recruit them and train them. Again, I've mentioned this before, but there's a lot of certification surrounding traditional data center technology. CCIE, CCNA, Juniper has, their certifications, which are
Right.
well known. But these certifications have not been evangelized or standardized for cloud networking at all. So the few people that really know cloud networking all come from School of Hard Knocks. The only way to really learn it is to either work for a partner like Equinix or something, or a
Yeah.
CSP, and just get into the guts of the machine and talk to hundreds and hundreds of customers until you see these patterns emerge. And it's tremendous trial and error.
Right. You're trying to ameliorate that lack of training, though, with your ACE program. Is that the purpose of that? Is that what its goal is? Is to upskill people to be able to build overlay networks or participate in building them?
Yes, 100%. I mean, Steve Mullaney, of course, has perceived this massive gap in the industry, which are qualified IT people that are trained up in multi-cloud networking, because the industry is strongly tilting to multi-cloud. I think Gartner recently said 77% of
Yeah.
Fortune 500 is in multi-cloud, and that's going to increase. And that there isn't really any kind of certification in multi-cloud networking. Like, it's chaotic, like you said, right?
Yeah.
And chaos provides all this opportunity, but it's really it's a mess.
Yeah.
So the ACE program is there to first just educate practitioners, IT pros, anyone who's interested. Could be developers, DevOps as well. Of course, they're part of this whole journey.
Mhm.
To come in and first just learn about the fundamentals of these different CSP network stacks, and then learn about how to make them all play nicely together with the Aviatrix overlay, the secure cloud network. Yeah.
How long does it take to get fully certified with ACE?
Oh, I think if you really become dedicated, you could probably knock out 3 base ACE courses in under a couple of months.
Really?
The associate you could knock out in a day or 2, and then there's a couple of more fundamental ones, that are architecture based and DevOps based, and those you could knock out in a week apiece. It's, just have to squeeze it in. But really, the stuff, once you actually peel it apart and understand the terminology and the acronym soup, starts to fall together pretty quickly. A lot of it is just figuring out what these terms in cloud really mean, these different products and network services, and how
Yeah.
they kind of relate to on-prem things. There's a shadow effect there.
Yeah, it's incredibly complex. To my shame, one of the first things which I did before I launched Silverlinings was announce, "Oh, we're going to do a taxonomy of this stuff," and then
Yeah.
now we don't talk about it because it turns out to be so incredibly complicated. And and also you did it, so I just send them to your course now, which is Steve's much happier about that. So and then it also has the benefit of your course having been prepared by people like you who really understand this at a DNA level, which is hard, isn't it? What do you think about this? Somebody was saying when I was first launching the site, they were saying it may help you to think of cloud as a giant data center. Just think of it as a data center. It's just a huge data center. Sort of amplified over a continent or something. Do you think that's a helpful analogy? And where does it take us if we follow that through in terms of what's actually happening? Because we still build our cloud within data centers and then extrapolate them out over huge distances. Where does it take us in the future? What happens to the edge of that cloud then? It feels like that's going to be an opportunity for interesting development by some companies, doesn't it?
Oh, 100%. Yeah, I think first and foremost, explaining cloud to people that are new to it or just want to know really what's happening there as a giant data center is both helpful and enlightening. It helps demystify
Mm.
what the CSPs are really doing. They are just giant data centers that are built to accommodate massive multi-tenant services.
Mm.
And these multi-tenant services have different infrastructure requirements depending upon whether they are IaaS, PaaS, or SaaS. So the look and feel of the metal and the cabling and the architecture underneath has been optimized for these different multi-tenant experiences and how much visibility and control each of these services yields the customer. But the recipe for hyperscaling, which to be fully honest, AWS really got right first. That is one of the
Right.
reasons why they are still in a dominant position in the market. They really took hyperscaling seriously because their retail side required it.
Right.
And through this growth curve, they went to expand their retail market. They realized, oh, holy hell, we have all this amazing ability to flex our infrastructure capacity and to scale it. And where we have extra compute, what can
Right.
we do with this? And let's farm it out, and that was kind of the beginning of it. But of course, Microsoft also was very early in the data center market with MSN and what was called BPOS, Business Professional Online Services, which is the
Mm.
grandfather of O365. So they were close on the heels of Amazon, and have a tremendous amount of experience building big data centers. So that is now a well-oiled machine, which means that the CSPs are going to turn their attention to those areas that are still ripe for innovation and ripe for hyperscaling, which is the edge. That's next on their target because, again, the regions, other than building new regions in new geographical locations to shave down the last mile, becomes the next viable target. And in fact, I just want to make this point. There's only so many places you can build a big cloud data center. You have to have the right power requirements. It has to be
Yeah.
geologically stable. It has to have cheap enough real estate to make the investment worth it because these are very large locations. They need to
Mm.
be close to metropolitan areas. So there's only so many places on the monopoly map left. I
Right.
mean, I can't just put a region in the middle of the Gobi Desert, right? I mean, the environmental factors there, it can't be, it's like Goldilocks, can't be too hot, can't be too cold. They have to worry about cooling and power in these things.
Right.
Another reason why you have to drive it to the edge, latency was the number one problem that a lot of my customers were trying to solve when I was a black belt. So I remember conversations where they would move all their data in the cloud. They would build a private circuit like Express Router, Direct Connect, or Fast Connect, and they would light up their hybrid application on-prem or in a campus that would want to consume this data. And then they were heartbroken when
Yeah.
there was, 10, 30, 40 milliseconds of latency.
Mm.
And they would come to me and they'd be like, why isn't this working? And I
Mm.
would say, well, the cloud is neat and special and has all kinds of services, but networking is still networking and fiber optics are still fiber optics. And the speed of light through glass is the same. And they'd say, well, how do we fix this? I would say the same way you fix it in the data center. You
Yeah.
cache it, you compress it, you deduplicate it, or you literally move physically the two things closer together. So there's only so much space for regions. There's only so much benefit to investing multiple billions of dollars in building these huge hubs because what really needs to be done is to bring the data closer to the customer.
Is that
That's the
happening? It's happening a bit, isn't it?
Yes, it's happening in different ways. It's happening where the CSPs are partnering with telcos and saying, let's put a mini cloud, if you will, which might be 20 or 30 racks or something
Right.
that's the size of a shipping container in your POP, like an AT&T POP or Verizon POP, or let's put these stacks on prem. But I think it's going with 5G is going to become even more profound. Let's put a cloud stack, at every office, at every floor of the office.
I agree with you. I think the actual physical form factor, which we don't get too hung up on usually with cloud, which is sort of a mistake because, as you say, you can't ignore you need air to breathe and so on. I mean, it is a fundamental the infrastructure in which the cloud is housed in. I don't talk about form factor very much, but we have sort of cloud envoys in some ways in the form of some of these consumer devices which sit there that you can talk to and ask them to turn the lights on and off. I mean, in a sense that they provide an analog for what a cloud node might look like at some point in the future, particularly if we slim the functions down to a few VMs and we go through some process of miniaturization. I mean, I was a bit disappointed because in another role, I'm a vice chairman of a cloud service provider, and we were talking about putting micro data centers in sub-Saharan Africa, and I was a bit disappointed that the micro data center, as you say, was the size of a complete shipping container. I was like, surely we could make this a little bit smaller than that. And then it turns out that actually that's not something which a lot of people are doing. I think Equinix is starting to look at some things like that. There are some startups, one of them is in Australia, where they actually put some of the racks and they bury them under the ground. So you have a sort of James Bond type effect with the button that you push and then the door opens like this. And they're putting them on street corners, things like that. So there is some work going on around form factor, which I think is interesting, but it adds another layer of complexity to network design. And I think another piece, going back to the software and the application side of this, which is going to be critical, is AI, isn't it? And AI and its role in automation. Going back, I'd like to just rewind a little bit, Woody, to one of your comments about like how do we deal with latency? And you were saying as a Microsoft Black Belt, you would have to do all sorts of workarounds to help them. At some point, does that kind of work get automated? Can we use AI to help us? And where are we on the journey to that kind of configuration help with those technologies?
I'm going to be really honest. I
Mm.
think AI, in terms of intelligent networking, is ripe for innovation. I don't think I've yet seen a company harness a mature AI system to really build an intelligent overlay. It's
Mm.
happening in the underlay. Like I said, CSPs are underlay monsters and they have tremendous talent here. So they're using AI or AI augmented systems to make their underlays more resilient and to do error detection and to comb through logs and what would take a human 2 weeks for correlation will take the AI 2 minutes. And that's happening. But you don't see anything really happening on the overlay level, especially across multiple clouds. So there's a tremendous opportunity in the industry for this. And a lot of it just has to do with the fact that right now AI is focused on business data, not infrastructure data. What's hard about AI and ML, remember, is that first you have to train the model.
Mm.
And in order to train the model, you need a really good data set.
Mm.
And sometimes with the modern network, feeding a pristine network data set into the model becomes challenging. So if we look at the kind of data set that the internet yields, it's very messy because the
Right.
internet is constantly shifting and changing. It's so multi-tenant and there's so much good put and bad put on there. So it's got to happen in private networks first, where customers have end-to-end control over the data and can feed these AI neural nets good data to train them. But I think in the next 3 to 5 years, we will see people turning the lights on in terms of, okay, I've now optimized a lot of my data with AI and ML that's business driven. Now I really want to get down into infrastructure. But businesses that are smart that aren't going to wait for enterprises to take that step can get ahead.
Yeah, it's definitely one of the bleeding edges of the technology which everybody's working around. What's your take on the recent stories about risks related to security as it being derived from APIs? Is API security something that Aviatrix is concerned about or is looking at?
Yes, Aviatrix is focused on, for now, the network and network security stack of the zero trust model, which is an important piece of the total zero trust network architecture model, meaning you have to assume breach. You have to assume the fact that digital sprawl and shadow IT will always be growing to some degree faster than traditional IT can keep up because of all the tools and CI/CD pipelines that enable this growth. And that what you want to do is build your infrastructure, meaning your network position, your firewall position, your routing position, to be very resilient to east-west and proliferation. So API attacks, of course, really started getting very serious in the industry around 2011. You had some high-profile tank attacks that were API-based attacks. Citigroup, RCA, Sony and people realized, oh my gosh, we're building all these API fabrics because of the modularity and ease of use, plug and play, as long as we have these APIs going. And really, it's a two-part thing. It's not just the language of the API, which is a lot of RPC and a lot of markup language like XML and JSON and SOAP and things. It's the method in which the relationships between the API brokers are instantiated. That is where other players in the industry are laser focused in cloud
Right.
native application protection or CNAP. So it's about making sure that from an IT perspective, network perspective, the trusted relationship between these API brokers is really buttoned up.
Right.
Remember, the hackers that are involved in this, the very serious ones that are going for the billion, hundreds of millions of dollars of ransomware, have day jobs. And a lot of them are working as, you know, API developers, application developers, and they're seeing what's failing in their own businesses.
Right.
And they're then extrapolating that to attack other businesses and other industries.
Right.
So it's
Yeah.
a very serious problem now. But again, it has to do not just with the quality of the API, but the trusted relationship from an identity perspective between the API brokers, which is still very easy to break.
I mean, a lot of people's reassurance around security in general, and indeed cloud performance in general, comes from operating within the right ecosystem, doesn't it? And I'm sure that that's true of Aviatrix as well. I mean, you have a pretty clearly defined ecosystem, I'm assuming, for companies that you work with for other parts of the solution. Is that right, Woody?
Yeah, I think from a security perspective, Aviatrix is focused on embedding security into the overlay,
Right.
which really has been a big miss from some of the other players in the market. You don't see anyone that's really minting as a programmable artifact security into the data plane. It's still bolted on. So they're
Right.
building these overlay networks using CSP native tools, but then in comes my firewall on a trolley, in comes my WAF on a trolley. Maybe it's cloud native, maybe it's marketplace. But then when you bolt on these security systems to the network, you create a strange bedfellow because the
Mm.
network doesn't anticipate this thing.
Mm.
The network has its own system of routing, which is very unique and CSP specific. And it's basically just wanting to move data as efficiently as possible and to make it easy to develop applications. It doesn't like to hairpin and bend data away from its intended path. So when you bolt a system on, you get involved in a very intense routing game that a lot of security professionals don't want to play.
Right.
It's not their bailiwick, right? To be BGP masters and to figure out how to suck all these routes in and maintain it. So if you embed security into the network and then make that network distributed, you solve one of the biggest pain points in the industry, which is the frustration and lack of agility that bolting on creates.
Yeah.
And then from there, you get into cloud native automation, you get into making sure that your policy, which is centralized, will be reflected not just in the overlay, but the actual CSP security system itself. So if we can't cover it through some kind of overlay, just tell the CSP what to do,
Mm.
and your policy can be working at multiple levels, which is super cool.
Yeah, it's also sort of the end goal of what people are really trying to achieve here. So it's great that you're providing that capability.
Yeah.
I thought it was interesting for me the other day that I was talking to the general manager of IBM's new, essentially it's a networking division, and he name checked Aviatrix as, and we're going into this space which Aviatrix is occupying. That's a pretty good hat tip from one of the largest and most illustrious computer communications companies in the world. You must feel good about that.
Yeah, it's nice to get the recognition. It
Yeah.
really is. We've grown a tremendous amount since our inception as just kind of an AWS orchestration platform, maybe 5, 6 years ago. Now, really, I think are where we need to be, which is, full on multi-cloud network elegance, security elegance, because that is predictive again of where the industry is headed.
Mm.
And it's also important to know that what began as kind of a dull murmur 3 or 4 years ago, which is now hockey sticked into a full roar, which is the cloud digital innovation teams handing the keys of the kingdom back to IT and saying, okay, we pioneered, We've learned enough about cloud to know how to build applications and to scale them, but really infrastructure is not our cup of tea.
Right.
And we need to bring the networking and security professionals from the data center back into the mix because they're the people with decades of experience here. But
Right.
then on top of that is, okay, how do these people ramp up quickly?
Yeah.
Right. To rise to the challenge, which is they've been given, which is, oh, it's serious now. SAP is going into the cloud. I don't trust digital innovation people to secure SAP. I trust them to build it and optimize it. But when it comes to security, that's not what they should be doing. So firewall team, cybersecurity team, come on. And they're like, oh, okay, how do I do this? What is my tool set like? That's what's happening right now in the industry. And that's another place where I think Aviatrix is doing interesting things and getting some recognition. So that's cool.
Yeah, it certainly is. You have a very nice way of bringing some of these internal dialogues to life, Woody, for people, because that I'm sure some of those conversations are probably maybe a little bit more robust and maybe a little bit sharper around the edges than
Yes.
you make it sound very collegial.
One last question for you before we part ways, and hopefully we have a chance to collaborate again.
I'd love to.
What do you think is going to happen in the next 3 to 5 years with 5G? You're a lot more focused and indebted to this topic than I am. I'm an overlay guy, not really a wireless expert. So you mentioned the telco-ification of the industry and 5G really becoming an industry focused, or has been since its inception. The CSPs have figured this out. They've cracked the code. What does that mean for CSP evolution, like, 2028 or something?
I think in addition to sort of telco-ification and cloud, I think there's a verticalization of 5G is really the big story right now. It's what is the purpose and what is the reason for 5G's existence? As I said before, it's not just a bandwidth upgrade to drive ARPU amongst consumer spending for telcos. Actually, there's very large amounts of 5G standard were really developed around being used inside buildings or for industrial applications. And all of a sudden, we're now seeing as an industry, people suddenly grasping that. When I was at the Mobile World Congress event in Barcelona a month ago, I went to see Huawei and they introduced me to their head of communications for the mining industry. And I was like, well, that's a strange flex. How big could that be? Well, it turns out mining is a $2 trillion industry. So if you spend some fraction of that on using 5G to automate your underground diggers, save lives, make things vastly more efficient, it's actually very, 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 very large number indeed. And then I went from Huawei over to Ericsson and I was saying, well, what's going on with private 5G? And they said, well, the mining market has absolutely taken off. And then when I went to see Nokia, they named mining as the #1 application now for private 5G that they're seeing. And I just thought that was really surprising because I didn't know that. And I'm interested in things I don't know, but I think a lot of other companies didn't know that either. Obviously, there are tons of vertical applications. And I think that the goal for service providers often has been to go as horizontal as you can with your application. Voice, there's a nice horizontal application. Everybody has to pay a bit of money. Internet access.
Right.
Well, now we're finding that we have to work a little bit harder in life to make our money. But if we do that the rewards are absolutely vast. And that's what we're seeing around, everybody talked about automotive as the big application, and now it's been overtaken by a bunch of other stuff. And we're only just getting started on life sciences and things like that. So that's where I think the money's going to be coming from. It's where we're focusing a lot of effort. What I didn't expect as a last thought to see after launching Silverlinings in January was that the entire dialogue, or at least 50% of it, moved into a cloud plus 5G conversation with service providers and telcos. That was very surprising to me. But it sort of makes sense that we're not talking about distinct network elements anymore, are we? We're talking about one solution, and people are buying, they're buying business outcomes. They're not buying technology anymore. So, that's part of this global trend that we're seeing right now, I think.
Well, Steve, thanks again. This was super cool. I really enjoyed the conversation and hope to have you back on the show sometime soon. Best of luck with Silverlinings.
I've learned a lot, and I really appreciate working with you guys at Aviatrix. I think you guys are doing a hell of a job and a fascinating company. I'll come back anytime, but you come on my show next time, and then we'll talk there.
Absolutely.
All right. Thank you so much, Woody.
All right. Take care.